well, my name's Sandra, and I'm running the program, so the ones that come all the time get to see me every Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday for the month of August. We've had, I talked about the YouTube, we've had some radio interviews, I've given you the feedback form, so that's really good. So anything that you'd like to put, if there's a topic that you'd like to have for next year, anything that you like, just pop on the form and you can hand it in at any time. I would just like to do the Irish Tasmania acknowledgement of Tasmanian Aboriginal peoples. We acknowledge the first Tasmanian Aboriginal people as the traditional custodians of this land, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and future who hold the memories, traditions, culture and hope of the Tasmanian's first peoples. Library Tasmania also pays respect to the resilience and strength of the Tasmanian Aboriginal people and extends that respect to all first Australian peoples.
And I will just introduce you to Maree.
Thank you, Sandra.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me again. And thank you for coming today. Can I presume you all have convict ancestry? Yes? Okay. This talk stemmed from being an adult ed tutor of convicts and their records over 25 years ago. Prior to this, I was research officer for the Genealogical Society, now the Family History of Tasmania. I was receiving letters that stated, my ancestor was a convict at Port Arthur. Hopefully we know now that Port Arthur was not where every convict went, but a place of secondary punishment. Sadly, sometimes I still see the same words on Facebook. I'll go quickly through these, but the first convicts were the settlers from Sydney to Risdon Cove, 20 and 24, and most of those went back. From England to Sullivan's Bay, from Sydney to Port Dalrymple. And that's from the Public Records Office of Tasmania, and that guide is online now, so you can get through the internet. Until 1812, no more convicts came directly to the BDL, only from New South Wales, sometimes recorded in dribs and drabs. 1812 came the Indefatigable, first ship to arrive directly from England with 199 male convicts. 1880, small and irregular shipments from Sydney, mostly secondarily convicted men, also convict servants, including some women and convict wives of free persons. From 1880, the irregular sailings commenced from England, and 1820 to 1829, approximately 1,200 convicts per annum. 1829, average of 2,000 per annum. 1842, numbers peaked at 5,300 and gradually declined to 1853 when the colony ceased. Can you see that one? No, it's a bit too small, a bit far back. August 2003, 17 years ago yesterday, was the date that marked the 150th anniversary of the day that ended of convicts transportation. I was honoured to be invited to do a presentation at Port Arthur. I was delighted to accept a replica of the limited edition Cessation of Transportation medal that was created that day. I got medal number 3. The first one went to either Jim Bacon, the late Premier, or Barry Jones, who was once the director of the Port Arthur Historic Site. Colonel Arthur reflected his training. He wrote that he considered every convict should be regularly and strictly accounted for, as soldiers are in their respective regiments, and that the whole of the course of their conduct, the services to which they are sent and from which they are discharged, the punishments they receive, as well as instances of good conduct they manifest, should be registered from the day of their landing until a period of their emancipation or death. Edward Cook, a law stationer who arrived in 1825 under a life sentence, was put to work to compile a series of black books containing particulars of convicts who had arrived since the Calcutta. 12,305 separate entries, 3 to a page. Cook worked at the Chief of Police Magistrate's residence at New Norfolk for 14 to 15 hours a day and very frequently on Sundays, under the direction of Josiah Spode, the Master. These records are now known as Con 31 for men and for women Con 40. The supplementary ledgers Con 32 for men and women, I think was another con, but I haven't written it down, naughty me. This is the book I'm talking about, Guide to the Public Records of Tasmania, now online in that reference down the bottom. And it's certainly worth perusing. It's in a PDF file, so you can actually do a search. And these are the totals from that book. In an attempt to reach a reasonable approximation, 3 separate calculations have been made. The third is entirely independent of the first 2, which have in common only C and G and included it. The numbers of convicts, even Peter Eldershaw, when he wrote this book, could not get a conclusive figure. There's 7,323, the top one. Table 2, 74,000, and again the bottom, 73,000. Hamish Maxwell Stewart uses the figures to claim 75,000 convicts to beat Van Diemen's Land. The Tasmanian Convicts Database contains 81,940, and that was compiled about 2,000 by the Archives and the Genealogical Society of Victoria. Tasmanian Link, or Libraries Tasmania, their figures are varied. The one I got last night was 81,517. It differs from 2014 and 2017. Now the Convicts Index includes transported from the British Isles, British colonies, including India, New Zealand and others, and including courts martial. Reconvicted, including those originally sent to New South Wales, other Australian states and New Zealand, and those who arrived free but were locally convicted to 1893. No Irish were sent directly from Ireland until 1840, when the New South Wales transportation system closed. The Irish who were transported to Van Diemen's Land before 1840 were either convicted outside Ireland or retransported from New South Wales. Female convicts. These numbers from the Research Centre, the Female Convict Research Centre, and as last night it was 13,690. 2012 it was 13,675, so we've gone up 15 more convicts. I'm slowly finding ones that were not added in. course, you can go to Convict through that site. And there's information on the Convict Life down in this bottom corner when you go into. Now, am I preaching to the converted to show you how to get into these places? I hope not. And then there's what's online. Worth going through, having a look, see what is there. Also worthwhile is Founders and Survivors. And below that is the female convicts or digital panopticon. And that's the banner from the front homepage. Search records, convict lives, historical background, research and teaching, the project. Worth going through it, have a look. Family search. That has got records available. Some are indexed, some aren't. Worth looking at, especially life after convict era. Now, lost records. My thanks to Brian Diamond, who still works here.
He's out of Berendale Repository at the moment.
Okay. Brian was working here, retired, he's back here, back with it again. A few decades ago, he alerted me to the following paper, Destroyed Tasmanian Convict Documents. And this comes from a paper presented by Peter Biscup at the 7th Biennial Conference of the Australian Society of Archivists, Hobart, from the 2nd to 6th of June 1989. He stated, the government of Tasmania had on many occasions, of which we are aware, sold or ordered for destruction, documents now regarded as being valuable. The Crown had no redress when these or other documents were offered for sale. The difficulty is to establish ownership. Biscup further suggested, disregard for official records has been part of the Tasmanians' way of life for most of the island's history. Much material had simply vanished, destroyed by fire, vermin, mould and human hand. In this, Tasmania was not greatly different from the mainland, where official documents have frequently suffered some familiar fates. Oh, that's right, we'll leave there. It's fine. In much the same way, everyone accrues possession and needs to periodically clear the clutter, possibly because of lack of storage space or when they move house. Who's moved house and cleared out and then you've thought, oh, I wish I had that still? I haven't, because I've lived in my house for 50 years. So when I go, it's my kids' job.
And I don't care. They can have it.
These periodic cleanups of accumulated material were ordered by various governments. In 1888, imperial records from the ordnance stores and the new wall filled 50 sacks, which were then sunk in the Derwent River mid-harbour. This clean-up of records included the Library of Port Arthur with its 4,000 New Testaments and 700 Bibles. Fortunately, an example of the Bibles are now to be found in the Museum of St David's Cathedral and possibly in private hands. In 1889, it was the turn of the colonial stores, and then in 1918, the Franklin Square Vault, where nothing has been destroyed without reference to the Chief Clerk. In 1889, Wheaton, the Chief Clerk, wrote to Penrith Fish, anything that I may write may fail to convey to your mind a true picture of the immense volume and bewildering confusion of the correspondence and documents to be dealt with. So far, most of the letters have had no relation to the old convict days, amongst which one comes across scores of familiar names. And it may strike you as most undesirable that all this correspondence should have been lying here for anyone to read. There are numbers of pardons written on parchments, which I should like you to see and decide what is to be done with them. With the job completed in 1890, Fisher arranged for the sinking of the unwanted material in the Derwent, but not before he'd sent a brief note to the Hobart historian and book collector, the solicitor, J. Backhouse Walker, mentioning the condemned documents. It struck me that you might like to look through them before they are destroyed, he told Backhouse, and if you thought any of them of value, would you perhaps advise as to their future custody and disposal? Official files are silent as to the fate of the unwanted material, and this cup mentions that some ended up in the possession of certain persons in Hobart, including possibly Walker himself, J.E. Calder, solicitor Cecil Allport, photographer J.W. Beattie and others. After his death in 1899, Walker's superb library, which contained convict and documents of official provenance, was sold to Angus and Robertson in Sydney. One of their most famous customers until his death in 1907 was David Scott Mitchell. After Mitchell's death, his mantle fell on William, who was later knighted, Dixon, another wealthy Sydneyite, whose library today supplements and rounds off the holdings of the Mitchell Library. And of course, there's the Dixon Library up in Sydney too. Dixon, he left his collection by bequest, and is known by that name. In Tasmania prior to 1949, very little systematic work had been done on the preservation of official documents in Tasmania, and the vaults of the Chief Secretary's Department came by default a kind of ungazetted state archives. Robert C. Sharman began work as archives officer in November 1949. In 1951, when he took up full-time duties, he arranged for Peter Aldershaw to be appointed as a temporary staff member. It has been the work of these two men who have provided a sound foundation for the Archives Office of Tasmania, which we now know as TAHO, Tasmanian Archives and Heritage Office. And that includes the preservation and, in some cases, the return of records of the Convict Department. There used to be a guide to the MM and ML series. Certainly there are microfilms held in with other microfilms newspapers, and these are found upstairs on level 2 in the microfilm room. Is that what they call it?
Yeah, microfilm room, yes.
Oh, sorry, microfilm room. Before you go into the TAHO reading room. It's also fortunate for us, the records of the State Library of New South Wales are becoming available online, and I got this snip this morning to show you where to go. The top it's in two halves. The top one with the URL and where's the other one gone? I've lost the other bit. But I did find 121 Tasmanian convict documents. No, 121 Tasmanian convict files with many documents in them, not indexed, so you have to look for what you might think you need and go through it. We're lucky we've got this. Okay. In 2008, Brian Rosette, in the introduction of Maree Island Convicts 1825 to 1832, gives us some history of the old Hobart Jail in Campbell Street, which started out as the prisoner barracks in 1821. He goes on to describe that it became the repository of hundreds of journals, registers and individual records of convict and jail population. These priceless leather-bound handwritten registers and journals were randomly piled high in what had been the upstairs dormitory of the House of Correction. With the closure of Campbell Street complex and the final transfer of the female prisoners to the Risdon prison in 1963, the dismantling of the House of Correction was hurriedly commenced to clear the site for what was to become a car park for many years. To empty the building, a vast number of books, registers and journals were transferred to the Archives Office of Tasmania. Unfortunately, time ran out for the demolition as the House of Correction roof started to give way. According to Brian, several years ago, a senior warder who was there at the time confided to him that he, the warder, was given the task of burning up all those beautiful old warrants and the beautiful old books. Day after day we burned. I don't know why the department burned the old warrants. I just don't know at all. Brian continues, thus the days, he along with the other warders and some prisoners carried out loads upon loads of books, warrants and parchment records. They were piled high in a heap and set fire to in the large open yard in the front of the House of Correction. During these several sad days, destruction of some small samples survived. The warders on duty prudently grabbed handfuls of the warrants from the edges of the fire and cautiously placed them in their pockets to be quietly carried out at knock-off time in the Gladstone bags. Some registers and daybooks even found their way onto trucks carting away rubbish up to the tip in landfill areas. A small quantity of these books fell off the back of the truck and are still quietly kept in private collection. However, these may be slowly returning to Libraries Tasmania. What does remain in the Tasmanian Archives and Heritage Office is a unique, albeit incomplete, record compilation of daily life in the early years of the convict settlement. Of course, the Tasmanian convict records are part of the UNESCO Memory of the World International Register, along with the records of New South Wales and Western Australia. The register is the equivalent for documents of the World Heritage List for built and natural sites. Registers specify just who were the convicts, their detailed descriptions, crimes and offences, punishments, general conduct and final disposal. However, missing among this brilliant collection of records is any register of convicts at the first settlement on Maree Island, 1825 to 1832. And these were found in the Oxfordshire Records Office and were transcribed and published by Brian. Sadly, names beginning with the letters A, E, F, G, H, I, J, Q, W, X and Z are missing. Though Brian suggests that there may not have been any convicts with surnames beginning with X and Z. I hope I'm not stealing any of Brian's thunder here, but Brian also explains the story of a dinner party given by Diego Bonacci, who lived on Maree Island in the 1880s. The dinner party given for prominent politicians and businessmen in 1886. Bonacci's grandson tells the story of where Diego produced the convict records and say, "Shall we see what of your ancestors came here for?" One night his house was burgled and nothing was stolen but these records. There are some records also in the Turnbull Library, Wellington, New Zealand. There were these convicts whose names are known and noted in the paper by Bruce Ralston. These were printed in the supplement of Our Heritage in History of the 6th Australasian Conference of Genealogy and History, Launceston 1991. Now, there should be a copy of that over at the Genie Society, the Family History Society. The late Nick Vine Hall, an eminent genealogist and New South Wales Welshman, that's wrong, anyway, in one of his publications suggests that several tons of New South Wales convict assignment ledgers were dumped in the sea past the heads in the late 1800s. And the heads of, I'm talking about Sydney, because of the stigma attached to them, how attitudes change. Why are so many family historians surprised to find convict ancestry in their family tree? Why didn't the entire society collude to cover up its past? Why did they move to Victoria, South Australia, Queensland, and even New Zealand to rid themselves of being called a convict? Babette Smith, in Australia's birthday, said, in the terms of time, pre-1960s and up to the 1970s, there was a sense of shame if you had a convict in your family. Grandparents particularly felt this. Most probably the grandparents she's talking about are the children of grandchildren of convicts. Would you talk, gloat, sky, triumph of any crime your parents or grandparents did at some time, and especially if they've been sent to jail? Would you? There was a stigma, and for some families there still is that stigma, particularly the older generation of convict ancestry. Probably not so much now though. When I first began my family history more than 30 years ago, no, it's getting close to 40, the convict records were already on microfilm, but they were filmed with this caution, with this type citation in capital letters below each frame of the film. And then by order of the Archives Authority, that's New South Wales, but that was similar for the Tasmanian. By order of the Tasmanian Library Board, the information in these records shall not be used so as to cause pain to any, or embarrass to any living person. Oh, that's the slide I had meant for you before about the collection in New South Wales. I said there was 121. Yeah. So it's a bit of going through. And prior to this, I've heard from older members of the local genealogical society that you needed to prove, yes, prove convict ancestry before the staff would check the records. Now they're all online. How things have changed. I also cited a letter of the 1960s from Archives Office of Tasmania to Frank Clune. Now Frank Clune wrote about all the Australian bushrangers, New South Wales writer. He wrote about Martin Cash and Matthew Brady, and in the archives, in this letter, the archives suggested it was acceptable to write about known convicts, such as these bushrangers, but not of other convicts, as it might cause embarrassment. It appears that some convicts' records have been purposely destroyed. Charles Davis, the founder of the firm of that name, does anyone remember the Charles Davis Company? Yeah, some of the younger ones might not. His conduct record, along with some other men who became prominent businessmen and politically inclined, has disappeared from the appropriate volume. In the 1900s, the 1900 Encyclopedia of Tasmania, his convict background is not mentioned, and it wasn't until the history of the firm was written by Alison Alexander in the late 1990s that the firm acknowledged his transportation. So it's only 30 years ago. A little bit about Charles Davis. He was quite wealthy, but yet his monument at Canadian Bay paid for by employee subscription. Deacon of the Congregational Church. That's the boy. And this is the one for Henry Proctor.
Yeah, I've noticed that. I've come across his page.
Yeah. And of course it's the record behind it too that gets lost. Who's well connected? Now I'm digressing a little, and I'll give you something to reflect about. And then again, my thanks to Brian Diamond for alerting me to the following article. He used to feed me a little bit. It was good. On arrival, a description of each convict was taken. According to a study reported in the Australian Paediatric Journal of 1976, the physical characteristics sought by the inspectors were nowhere defined. So it was up to their imagination, whatever they thought that they wrote down about the convicts. 2 ships were studied, and the article states, the gross disparity between the results for both ships can only be attributed to variation between 2 different observations. For one of the vessels, the visages were all described as long and round, and the other only as oval. Similarly, one observer noted 20 black eyebrows and no but dark brown, while the other noted only dark brown and no black. Likewise, one observer used the word pale and another fair to describe the complexion of some of the convicts. This part of the article concludes that the observers were each identifying real differences between subjects, but using different standards. This article also examined tattoos. It is suggested that tattooing was self-inflicted. 70% of the dots and letters were on the left hand or arm. Initials were those of the bearer's initials, or possibly of relations or sweethearts. Dots were usually considered a lower class criminal characteristic and commonly found on the back of the fingers or between the thumb and index fingers. And I think Simon Barnard and Hamish are saying that they were the formation of gangs or cliches on the boat. The anchor simple design was most common, occurred alone and with dots or letters that were to be found twice as often on the left arm or hand as on the right. The next most popular design was the cross or crucifix, then various amorous or sexual motives. The report, which studied only boys under the age of 19 on 3 ships that arrived, 1837, 1841 and 1842, also suggested it was a teenage fad for those born between 1826 and 1830. And just saying that an anchor, Victorian symbol for hope, the Victorians loved their symbols, as in faith, hope and charity. The anchor was hope, the faith was the cross, and lastly the heart for charity. And I'm talking about Hamish Maxwell Stewart again, on the town. And Tahoe Archives and Hamish suggests that it's a meaning is prostitution. The Female Convict Research Group suggests that it may have been on the parish or receiving alms or dole. And also the Convict Research Group for the Irish convict, those convicted of vagrancy were generally working as prostitutes, women who could not be convicted of prostitution, but in Ireland they could be convicted of vagrancy, and this law was often used to arrest and charge prostitutes. And that's some of the ships that the Female Research Centre looked at. Henry FINLAY wrote have not to hold. And he gives a similar meaning to prostitution. In this book it says one comment in 1857 quotes the evidence of John Moody, a magistrate, who gave evidence before the Select Committee on Transportation in 1837, that's in New South Wales. I should say of almost whole of the convict women to arrive in New South Wales that there was hardly an exception among them. There were some sent out for bigamy. They have a better society, but others have attended to theatres, the lowest girls possible that have been street walkers, all sorts, but they all smoke, drink, and in fact speak in plain language. I consider them all prostitutes. Michael Sturmer has shown that the term prostitute was often used in contemporary England as referring to a woman living in what today we describe as a de facto relationship. The prostitute was not necessarily a professional harlot or not even promiscuous. And then in short, the woman labelled a prostitute may be guilty of no more than cohabitation. And that's a little bit clearer in there, sorry I forgot that one. Henry FINLAY was in the law department down here at the university. Convict Descriptions. Now, Mr. Gunn, the chief superintendent, with 2 or 3 of his clerks. William Gates was a Canadian rebel, was sent out by George Arthur. George Arthur was the governor of Canada in 1838, around that time. Around this time, the Americans and the Canadians, there was a problem. They were convicted for taking part in rebellions against the colonial government. Mr. Gunn, the superintendent, with 2 or 3 clerks, were in the cabin. Before them, we were brought separately, this is William Gates' words, to undergo our most searching examinations. Questions were asked and answers was given to our names, ages, trades, nativity, where they were born of course, religion, whether married, if so, where lived the wife, what the number of the children, their sex, ages, whether our parents were alive, their ages, religion, residence, place of nativity, the amount of education, whether we could read or write ourselves, when arrested, where and when and for what tried, how long sentence, when we left Canada, what were our numbers and what were the scars on our persons. It would be lovely if we had all that information, but we don't. That's his remembrance of it. Of course, we could not tell what was our sentence, this is Gates speaking again, or how long its duration. For this we were entirely ignorant ourselves, whereupon the clerk was ordered to put us down for life. At the close of the examination, we were taken into another room, stripped of our clothing and minute description of every scar, blemish or mole on our persons, based on record. There was another officer among the rest who eyed us most searchingly and who put upon record a faithful description of our features, colour of hair, eyebrows, eyes, number of teeth lost, that'd be fun to know, appearance of nose, ears, chin, mouth, etc., together with our height and weight. We got the height, but we didn't get the weight, did we? By this method, and to which every person is forced to submit, such a minute description is to obtain that is utterly hopeless for a prisoner to think of escaping from the infernal clutches of those petty tyrants that hold such a detestable sway in that prison man. He wasn't happy about it. Pock Peter from smallpox, chickenpox or cowpox. That's just my thoughts. It's usually, everyone says smallpox, but cowpox was raging then. Especially those women working in animal husbandry, cow herders and dairy maids. 16-year-old Louisa Walter, a dairymaid and plain cook, was only slightly pock-pitted. Was cowpox the cause of her pox? I believe these diseases have virtually been eliminated by the vaccines. This is a register Con 78.3, and some of these information on this register is missing off the convict's actual conduct record. This is for William Worsley in case, but it's also indexed under Ancestry.com. Sandra, do you know if Ancestry.com is still available for those at home, or that's ceased?
I'm not quite sure because it could cease at any time. It's gone through the whole of Australia, so I really don't know. That we were given a date, but I don't know if they've extended that date or not.
Yeah, they have.
They have extended it.
And as long as the reading room is closed, they've kept it online.
So if you want to check any convicts for their ancestry on 78 slash, it's 3, slash 3 is the, it's alphabetical, and of course William Worsley is in the last section, in that last volume. Oh, and I better warn you, they're not in chronological order, they're just tucked here and there. You need to go through the whole lot. You can see there it's not alphabetical and it's not chronological. All the surnames for W are all in one part, and similarly for other surnames, so it's indexed only by the first letter of the surname. That was William Worsley's. And that's his conduct record, and that one's not on there, so there might be some more. If your ancestor was up north in that time, there might be some more about. Okay, probation system. That was from 1839, I think. 1839 to 1854. There's a good book by Ian Brand, it was published in 1990. If you can have a look at that one, you'd be lucky to get a hold of a copy Thursdays. But that shows most of the probation stations. He did miss a few. But this is on the interactive map that's on at that website up the top. Libraries, Tasmania Government, Convict Portal, Pages Convict. And it's an interactive map showing where the probation stations, the other hiring depots, wherever convicts work. Newly arrived convicts were organised into labouring gangs and stationed for a probationary period. This period varied according to the length of their sentence. Has anyone heard of task work? Hands up so I can see a few hands notes there. Any extra task work successfully completed is credited for use or early release from the probationary gang. Records of task work have not survived, but there are notations on a convict's record. Misdemeanours, misbehaviour could extend the time of service in a probationary gang. That's these. Those are mine, I got them years ago. Which is which? One's been one, one's been. That's the task work. The ocean on the floor. That's got one's for men and one's for women. That's the thing. That's for the women. This one's for men. You don't need to make that on class for this one's for men. So you can come up and have a look after the. And I've had them rolled up for hymns. I unrolled them the other way last night, but I didn't have to do it for all that. But anyway, task work for women convicts. And that's dated 1849. And summer months, the task work was with the seasons of the year. Because there was little light through the winter, they worked shorter hours. The spring and autumn were more or less even, they worked similar hours, but in the summer they worked longer. And class 1 needlewoman, she had to finish 8 handkerchiefs. There was expected to finish 8 handkerchiefs in a day. Class 2 only had to do 6, and class 3 only 4. So a similar. Laundress had to wash 8 blankets. Class 2 had to wash 6 blankets, and class 3 4 blankets. In March, October, class 2 had to wash 5.5 blankets. Excuse me, how do you wash half a blanket? And for men, seasons, first was on maximus for able-bodied, doing work for which they are experienced. Second, for medium or able-bodied, doing work for which they were not familiar, or vice versa. And third class or minimum for inexperienced and not fully fit. And that's some of the things some of the things the men had to complete. A brickmaker 326, third class 134. So some of the occupations, but they're all listed on those. For the following trades, no specific quantity of labour can be generally allotted. So they just have to be guessed at, I guess. And this is the extract from Overseas Daily Workbook for John Powell, further John Calvin. His total monthly credits, 44 and 5/8 an hour. That's another ledger. Amount of time credited daily, as I said, total monthly credit 44 and 5/8. Amount of task work performed daily. And on John's convict record, where I've underlined it, that shows that he 10 days gained by task work. So he got off his sentence by 10 days. Why did some of them gain hundreds of days from their probation? Thomas Cook gained 410 days. His sentence was life. Patrick Reardon Washidi, his sentence was 7 years, and he gained 36 days. Dennis Collins, 343 days, but his sentence again was a long one, 15 years. Port Arthur, there's some task work in there on 94/1. Was task work comparable to date early release for good behaviour? I think it might have been. Particularly was that equivalent to days parole, food for thought. Manuel Smith, he was charged on the 14th of April 1864, sentenced to 12 months, but he was freed by January 1865. Presumably he did, gain some task work, gain time off.
Excuse me, was task work in additional to what they had to
Well,
do?
what they were supposed to do. So if they worked well, worked hard, and did extra, so they can do extra. On the women's task work, just being in the choir was one part of it. So they gained extra there.
Now, there aren't any records for ticket of leave butts. There are in New South Wales, they are not here, so they went swimming in the river, I guess. Certificates of conditional absolute harm and free certificates for individuals. These are the butts. They used to be joined in a book, so, you know. I used to get queries from people from New South Wales. Can I get, you know, to look at the butt for a conditional harm and things like that, because they have them over there. This is a regulation for the hiring of probationary ticket of leave holders. And CON 77/229 if you want to go and look it up. Regulations for ticket of leave holders in Van Diemen's Land, 1851 and 1849. I know it's hard to read. I'm getting into it. But down the bottom where I've underlined them, we were required to pay £15 as the cost of the conveyance to the colony. There it is. Before they were allowed to receive further indulgences of conditional harm. So when they had their ticket of leave, this document said that they had to leave. That's 1849. If we go to this record of John Matthews down in the corner where I've marked it, can't read it. Is that better? He had to pay half the cost of his passage. I think this ruling was eased or stopped before transportation, but I'm not sure. Convict pardons now. Anyone remember Miss Wayne's or know of Miss Wayne's index? This is a card from her. She's got beautiful writing. She was in the archives office or the pre-archives office and did a lot of indexing of things. Her cards are actually online too. So convict pardons the recipients were charged a fee of 5 and 6 pence on the receipt of the same. Discussion as to which office should receive the same British or Barney. Okay, this one's come up here, I don't know. Ticket of leave, originally known as a pass, convicts were allowed to work for him or herself. Like parole now, they were excused from going into employment or assignment. They had to acquire property. They could acquire property. They were required to reside in a specified district and report occasionally. Could not move to another district without permission or a pass. They had to abide by certain other conditions, attend church service weekly, appear before the magistrate when required, did not move into another district without permission. Passport tickets were issued to those ticket and leavers whose work required them to travel between districts. There's a few of those I've seen. Tickets of leave could be revoked for bad conduct. Ticket of leave generally granted to an assigned convict who had served 4 years of a 7-year sentence, 6 years of a 14-year sentence, 8 years of a life sentence. To be eligible, the assigned convict required a recommendation from their master as to their good service and to be signed by a resident magistrate who certified that no colonial conviction existed. If a colonial conviction existed, an additional period of time had to be served before the convict could be considered. After a period of time, ticket of leave convicts were eligible for conditional pardon. This is Thomas Trotman for Narbonne, tried at the bar, last period of size is 1921. That's his ticket of leave. That's the front, with his name underlined. That's the back, with his description. That's what the back says. So, sorry, and that's a comparison of his features, his trade, his height. He'd grown a couple of an inch and a quarter in 4 years. And of course, the newspapers have lots of reports of particular leaving certificates granted. And this is Thomas Trotman. He's got a picture in the State Library of Victoria. He'd been married 63 years. That's from trial. Very trial. 100, no, this is his wife, and 100 descendants. Okay, this is a conditional pardon for John Plumtree, for Augusta Jesse. And he was recommended pardon on the 24th of January 1844 with his free certificate noted 1845. Once they handed in their certificates to get the next certificate, it would have been destroyed, I think. William Booth of Bilmore, and on the reverse, that's a conditional pardon. His trade differed a little bit. His age was 10 years older. His hair went from red to sandy, and his eyebrows the same. Mary Meadows, a conditional pardon, shall remain in Van Diemen's Land or one of Her Majesty's Australian colonies or New Zealand. So that was the condition. James Brady, not very clear, are they? They were fun to try and find the name. He was charged in non-system. Shall not continue to reside in the said island of Van Diemen's Land or its dependencies or the UK. So even though he was native born here, possibly, no, Capo shall not. But even a native born here, I know he's got sentenced to 7 years, could not remain after the completion of his sentence. He had to leave Tasmania. Van Diemen's Land. Condition, certificate of freedom. No conditions were attached. All rights and privileges restored, including the right to return to their homeland. Convicts for the life sentence are not eligible for a certificate of freedom, but could receive it after. And there's a memorandum there. Should the certificate of freedom be lost, mislaid or destroyed, no duplicate or new certificate will on any account be granted by the government. So if I look after a kid, sorry, but James Dodd by Paramus, 1839, certificate of freedom. Has got his description on it at the top. That's it there. And that's his convict record. Mary Connors for John Calvin. And 6 years when she got a conditional pardon. She had a long visit, was long, now full. Forehead's medium, now it's high. Eyebrows are dark brown, now black. Eyes are dark brown, black. Nose medium, slightly puffed, was just leaving when she left. And he marks hearing on the red check, which just had a plain line on the red check. I talked about the Canadian political prisoners earlier, who were sentenced by Arthur. They received their free pardons. And so did the 40 machine breakers that came in the last protests. Hugh Calhoun, he was one of the Canadian political prisoners. A free pardon. Absolute pardon for John Curran on Sir Godfrey Webster. Absolute pardon for John Lewis on the William Bunston to New South Wales, so he must have been transported down here. I mentioned some of the Mitchell Library records. Malcolm Ward, one of the members of the Tasmanian Family History Society, went looking around the Mitchell Library, and he's found 109 conditional pardons up there. They're supposed to be indexed by the Tasmanian Family History Society, but I haven't heard much about that. That was 3 years ago. Now, the microfilm for the Mitchell Libraries and the microfilm room, I don't know if these will come up through that site for the State Library of Tasmania at in the Sydney Library, Sydney Library of New South Wales. They might do. But these are certainly up in the microfilm room upstairs, upstairs. And there's some of the that I've picked up. I've got the image of those. A cash list for the people who then came on the protest in 1831. It's a single page note of the convict's name and the amount of money that they brought in with them. Convict bank accounts, rules and regulations from Hobart Town Gazette of June 1828. Deposits on a Saturday in sums of less than 5 shillings. No money to be withdrawn within 4 months and only paid on a Wednesday. Money taken from convicts on arrival not allowed to be withdrawn without authority. Interest of 10% will be allowed, calculated from the 15th of the last day each month. Interest to ascertain every 6 months and paid after deducting the salary of the clerk. The expenses for book and other incidents. 1829. Deposits every bank day is opened in sums of less than 5 shillings. That's a lot of money back then. Interest of 5%. Interest gone down, clear of all deductions. Interest will be calculated from the first of the month. Interest will not be allowed on any sum that is lain there for 3 months. Payments will only be allowed on Wednesdays only. One convict on the Paraja stated she had £800 at interest. There's some good stuff there if you can find it, but they're certainly not indexed.
Excuse me, were any of it, did they get some sort of a wage at all?
They would have if they served their time and had a ticket of leave.
Right.
They would earn money then. But the convict savings account, interesting stuff there. And that's enough. Sorry I've gone over time, I usually do that, sorry. Well, I hope you've done.
So, anyone got any questions? Or you can stay for a while.
Yeah, this one was on, this is on the digital panopticon. It's a chart of tracing down from the conviction, coming down the offences and where you might find information. I like that one. I like that one. Pictures of convict chips, like hen's teeth. About 300, I don't know how many convict chips there were there. 300 something, I don't know. But that's the Willie Bryan that came with Tasmania. Actually, I'm following more. I've been keeping a list of convict chips. Facebook has been providing me with a few more.